The rhythmic hiss of a ventilator at 3 in the morning doesn't sound like a countdown. To Maggie, it was just Tuesday. But when the double doors slid open and 3 men in rain-soaked jackets stepped onto the linoleum, the smell of cordite instantly overpowered the sterile bleach. The Puritan Bennett 980. Ventilator pushing air into the man in room 4 sounded like a mechanical lung drowning in its own spit. Whoosh, click, hiss. Maggie leaned against the cold laminate counter of the central nurses' station, staring at the telemetry monitors until the jagged green lines blurred into a solid, glowing wall. Her lower back throbbed, a dull, insistent ache radiating down her right sciatic nerve. 12-hour shifts on hard hospital floors did that to a person. 12 hours of pretending to give a damn did much worse. Room 4 held a man named David. At least, the chart clipped to the plastic bin outside his glass door said David. He'd come in via medevac chopper 3 days ago, sporting 4 exceptionally neat entry wounds in his torso, a shattered left femur, and 0 ID. The guys who brought him in wore tactical gear without name tapes, spoke in clipped acronyms, and smelled like sweat and helicopter exhaust. Now the quiet professionals were gone, leaving only David, a tangle of intravenous lines, and the overwhelming metallic stench of old injuries and iodine. Maggie rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. Her skin was dry, peeling around the cuticles from aggressive, mandatory hand-washing. She needed a coffee. Not the sludge sitting in the break-room carafe since 7 last night, but a real one. Instead, she settled for chewing on a stale piece of peppermint gum. The ICU was operating on a skeleton crew. It was 3:15 a.m. The witching hour, when the human body decides it's simply too tired to keep fighting. Down the hall, a resident named Kyle was asleep in a chair, his mouth hanging open, entirely useless. It was quiet. Too quiet, a civilian might say, but Maggie hated that phrase. Quiet was just the absence of noise. It didn't mean peace. The heavy fire doors at the north end of the corridor, the ones leading to the emergency stairwell, clicked shut. It wasn't the pneumatic hiss of the main elevators. It was the heavy, metallic thud of a door that had been pulled open slowly and allowed to close just as deliberately. Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't drop her pen. She just stopped chewing her gum. She turned her head, eyes tracking over the rims of her reading glasses. 3 men. They were walking down the primary corridor, their boots squeaking faintly against the freshly buffed linoleum. Rainwater dripped from the hems of their dark nylon jackets, leaving a trail of dark spots on the pristine floor. Her first thought was profoundly petty. Greg from Environmental Services is going to throw an absolute fit about those puddles. Her second thought was analytical, a leftover reflex from a life she had tried to bury in a footlocker in her attic. She didn't look at their faces. She looked at their center of gravity. They walked with their weight pitched slightly forward, hands hovering naturally near the waistlines of their jackets. They weren't looking at the room numbers. They were scanning the corners. They were looking for cameras, for blind spots, for exits. The man in the lead, a stocky guy with a neck thicker than his skull, paused outside room 4. Maggie sighed. She actually, genuinely sighed, feeling a profound wave of exhaustion wash over her. She pushed herself off the counter, her joints popping in the quiet ward. She slipped her heavy trauma shears out of her scrub pocket and held them loosely against her thigh, obscured by her clipboard. "Visiting hours ended at 8, Maggie said. Her voice wasn't authoritative. It was flat, bored, the voice of a woman who argued with dementia patients and arrogant surgeons for a living. The 3 men stopped. The leader turned his head. He had dark hair, slicked back with something that smelled faintly of coconut oil, completely at odds with the damp, sour odor of unwashed clothes and wet leather radiating off his crew. "We are here for family," the man said. His accent was thick, his tone conversational. Tomas, he looked like a Tomas. He smiled, showing a chipped front tooth. "Our brother, he had an accident." "Your brother is in a medically induced coma," Maggie replied, taking 2 steps out from behind the heavy wooden desk. She stopped at a precise angle, keeping a heavy rolling crash cart between herself and the man on the right. "And unless you are his proxy, you need to turn around, walk back down those stairs, and take it up with daytime security." Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. They were dead eyes, flat, black, and completely indifferent. "We just need a minute alone with him, nurse, to say goodbye. It is a religious thing." The man on the left shifted his weight. His hand slipped beneath the zipper of his jacket. The metallic clack of a slide being pulled back slightly to check a chamber echoed in the quiet hallway. It was loud enough to be unmistakable. Maggie felt the familiar cold prickle of adrenaline wash over her scalp. It was a vile sensation. She had spent 5 years in the dust of Kandahar and the scrubland of Syria, looking through a glass optic, controlling her breathing until the world narrowed down to a single, microscopic point. She had taken a nursing job because she wanted to fix holes, not make them. She wanted the mundane. She looked at Thomas, then at the man in the bed behind the glass. David was a dead man. The cartel, and these were absolutely cartel, wearing the arrogance of men used to operating with impunity, would just unplug his ventilator, inject an air bubble into his IV, or simply put a suppressed round through his temple. "Walk away," her brain whispered. "You make $35 an hour. This is not your problem. Let them have him." She took a step back. Thomas's smile widened. He thought she was yielding. "Smart girl," Thomas murmured, turning his back on her to reach for the handle of room 4. But Maggie wasn't yielding. She was establishing her firing line, and she realized, with a deep, cynical bitterness, that she was really pissed off that these men were tracking mud into her ICU. Maggie didn't scream. Screaming wasted oxygen and telegraphed panic. Instead, she gripped the heavy plastic handle of the crash cart with her left hand. It weighed over 200 pounds, loaded with a defibrillator, oxygen tanks, and drawers of heavy fluid bags. As Thomas pushed the glass door to room 4 open, the man on the right, the one who had checked his weapon, stepped forward to cover the hallway. He made a fatal error. He looked at Maggie not as a threat, but as a frightened civilian. He let his eyes drop to her waist, expecting her to cower. Maggie violently shoved the crash cart forward. The hard rubber wheels shrieked against the linoleum. The heavy metal corner of the cart slammed directly into the right man's kneecap. A sickening crack echoed through the ward, followed instantly by a guttural yell. The man buckled, his leg folding inward at an unnatural angle. The sound was messy. It wasn't the clean, distant drop of a target through a scope. It was visceral and loud, and Maggie hated it. Before the cart even stopped rolling, Maggie closed the distance. The man was falling forward, his hands coming out to catch himself, his jacket flaring open to reveal the black grip of a pistol tucked into his waistband. Maggie didn't go for the gun. That was movie bullshit. The retention holster would slow her down. She brought her right hand up, the heavy steel trauma shears gripped like a punch dagger. She drove the blunt, thick edge of the shears straight into the soft hollow of his throat, right below the Adam's apple. The man choked, a wet, horrifying gurgle erupting from his lips. Blood sprayed across the back of Maggie's hand, hot, sticky, and smelling of copper. He collapsed onto his side, hands clawing desperately at his own ruined trachea. "One. Puta!" the man on the left shouted, pulling his weapon free. Maggie didn't try to stand her ground. She dropped, letting her knees hit the hard floor, a jolt of pain shooting up her spine, and rolled behind the bulky base of the nurse's station counter. Pop, pop, pop. 3 suppressed shots punched into the laminate wood above her head. The sound was distinct, like a heavy staple gun driving into drywall. Shards of plastic and cheap wood showered down on her hair. A telemetry monitor shattered, showering the floor with sparking glass and killing the soft, green glow of the station. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her hands were shaking. She wasn't a close-quarters fighter. She was a sniper. She hated being close enough to smell them. She hated the warmth of the blood drying on her knuckles. "Spread out," Thomas's voice came, sharp and calm, filtering through the sudden quiet. He hadn't panicked. "Hector, watch the stairs. She's behind the desk." Maggie scrambled on her hands and knees, ignoring the sting of broken glass biting through her thin scrub pants. The space behind the desk was narrow, a tunnel of computer towers and rolling chairs. She needed a weapon, a real one. She crawled toward the fallen man writhing near the crash cart. He was bleeding out rapidly, his face turning a dusky, bruised purple as he suffocated. Maggie reached out, her fingers slipping on the slick floor, and grabbed the grip of his pistol. She yanked it free. A Glock 19, standard, reliable. Heavy in her hand. It felt entirely foreign without a stock against her shoulder, but the geometry of the grip settled into her palm like an old, bad habit. She checked the chamber with a quick, tactical press check. Loaded. "Nurse," Thomas called out. His voice was closer now. He was moving toward the desk, walking softly. "You just made a very stupid mistake. You should have walked away." "I really should have," Maggie thought grimly. She wiped the blood off her hand onto her scrub top. It left a smeared, rusty stain. She pressed her back against the cheap wood of the cabinet, listening. The hum of the hospital ventilation system masked the lighter footsteps, but Thomas's wet boots gave him away. Squeak. Pause. Squeak. He was flanking the right side of the desk. Hector, the other man, would be covering the left. They were trying to box her in. Maggie squeezed her eyes shut, visualizing the layout of the ICU. The overhead fluorescent lights were bright, casting harsh, distinct shadows. If she peeked the corner, Hector would take her head off. She needed to blind them. Her hand brushed against something cold and cylindrical under the desk. A standard-issue hospital fire extinguisher. CO2. She grabbed it by the neck, pulled the metal pin with her teeth, cutting her lip on the sharp ring, and spat it out. She tasted rust. Imperfect, she reminded herself. Just survive the next 10 seconds. Maggie rolled onto her back, aimed the nozzle of the extinguisher toward the left edge of the desk, where Hector's shadow was stretching across the floor, and squeezed the trigger. A deafening roar filled the ICU as a massive, freezing cloud of thick, white carbon dioxide blasted across the corridor. The temperature plummeted instantly. The thick white fog hit Hector directly in the face, just as he leaned around the corner. He cursed, coughing violently, blinded by the sudden wall of freezing gas. Maggie didn't hesitate. She dropped the extinguisher, pushed herself up off the floor, and pivoted to the right. Thomas was already rounding the desk, his suppressed weapon raised. He had quick reflexes, but the sudden roar of the extinguisher had drawn his eyes for a fraction of a second. It was all the time a sniper needed. Maggie brought the Glock up. She didn't aim with the sights, she aimed with the structure of her body. She pulled the trigger twice. The roar of the unsuppressed Glock was deafening in the enclosed space. The concussive blast slapped against the walls, overpowering the hiss of the ventilators and the frantic beeping of the remaining heart monitors. The first hollow point round caught Thomas in the right shoulder, spinning him violently backward. The second round shattered his collarbone. He hit the glass wall of room 4 hard, sliding down, leaving a thick, dark streak of blood against the transparent pane. His gun clattered across the linoleum. 2 down, 1 blind. Maggie didn't freeze to admire her work. Her ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine drowning out the ambient noise of the hospital. She swung the gun toward the dissipating white cloud of the fire extinguisher, hunting for Hector's silhouette. The white fog hung in the air like a localized blizzard, swirling violently where Hector's frantic backward movements disturbed it. Maggie stayed low, her right cheek pressed close to the cold, damp linoleum. She tracked the sound, a heavy, wet cough, the erratic scrape of rubber soles retreating. Hector was backing up, and he was firing blindly as he went. Crack, crack, crack. The suppressed rounds chewed through the drywall behind Maggie, sounding like heavy fists punching wet cardboard. One of the bullets shattered a heavy glass carafe of sterile water resting on a supply shelf above the nurse's station. The liquid cascaded down the wall, sounding exactly like the miserable rain beating against the hospital windows outside. It pooled around Maggie's knees, soaking instantly into her thin, worn scrubs. The water was icy, a sharp contrast to the slick, hot sweat breaking out across her shoulders. Her thumb instinctively brushed the slide catch of the Glock. She breathed in through her nose, pulling the sharp, metallic tang of sulfur and burnt carbon deep into her lungs. It overpowered the sterile, omnipresent smell of bleach and floor wax. It smelled like Helmand Province. It smelled like the worst, longest year of her life. Dug into a ridgeline, drinking lukewarm water from a plastic bladder while waiting for a target to cross a threshold. She kept her profile minimal. The central desk was a broad U-shape, and Hector was retreating towards the medication dispensary room at the end of the hall. It was a fatal, panic-driven error. The dispensary had a reinforced steel door and a biometric lock. He was backing into a dead end. Maggie didn't rush. Rushing got you killed. The adrenaline was cresting now, turning her peripheral vision into a sharp, narrow, hyper-focused tunnel. The persistent ache in her lower back vanished, temporarily erased by a massive dump of cortisol. "Tomas!" Hector yelled. His voice was tight, pitching upward with raw panic. "Tomas, talk to me!" Maggie crept around the far side of the desk, keeping her footfalls meticulously light. She stepped over a scattering of plastic syringe wrappers and a ruined, sparking keyboard that had been knocked to the floor. The CO2 fog was finally thinning, settling into a hazy grey veil under the harsh fluorescent lights. She saw Hector's silhouette. He was frantically yanking at the dispensary door handle with his left hand, his right hand gripping a compact submachine gun, a MAC-10 or some cheap, heavy clone, pointing it wildly down the hallway, tracking shadows. He was breathing hard, a ragged, wheezing sound that echoed off the hard surfaces of the ward. Maggie raised the Glock. The front sight post settled squarely on the center of mass, visible between his flailing arms. She didn't look at his face. "It's different when you look them in the eye," an old platoon sergeant had told her once, sitting on the tailgate of a Humvee. Through a glass optic, it's a math problem. Wind, distance, gravity. Up close, it's just murder. Hector turned his head. His eyes went wide, catching the harsh overhead light, the whites showing all the way around his irises. He realized the silence wasn't empty. He brought the heavy barrel of his weapon around, his finger whitening on the trigger. Maggie pressed her trigger. Smooth, steady pressure, straight to the rear. The gun bucked violently in her hand, Once, twice. The math was simple. Center mass. The kinetic energy of the 9mm hollow point rounds hit Hector like a heavy, invisible sledgehammer. He didn't fly backward. Real life didn't work like the movies. He simply folded. The structural integrity of his body gave out instantly, his knees buckling outward. He collapsed against the heavy metal door of the dispensary, sliding down, leaving a faint smear, until he was nothing more than a crumpled heap of wet nylon and silence. The clatter of his dropped weapon echoed sharply down the long, empty hall, sliding a few feet before spinning to a halt. Maggie stood perfectly still for 3 agonizing seconds. She kept the Glock raised, her arms rigid, her eyes scanning his chest for the shallow rise and fall of breath. Nothing. He was perfectly still. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing heavy against her eardrums. The ringing in her ears from the unsuppressed gunfire was a persistent, high-frequency whine, drowning out the hum of the HVAC system. She exhaled, a long, shaky breath that tasted like peppermint and copper. It was over. Then the hospital violently reasserted itself. A sharp, frantic screech sliced through the quiet. It wasn't gunfire. It wasn't a dying man. It was an alarm. A high-priority sustained tone designed specifically to cut through sleep and noise to induce immediate panic in medical staff. Maggie pivoted, her rigid combat stance instantly dissolving into a frantic, hurried stumble. Room 4. David, the overhead monitor outside his glass room, was flashing a brilliant, terrifying, strobing red. Art line low. BP 60/40, VTAH. One of Hector's panicked, stray bullets had gone straight through the glass wall. Maggie dropped the Glock. It hit the linoleum with a heavy, hollow thud, sliding away into a puddle of spilled, sterile water. She didn't look back at it. The operator was gone. The nurse was back on the clock. She shoved the heavy glass door open. It groaned in protest. The neat, circular bullet hole radiating a massive, glittering spiderweb of cracks across the surface. Inside, the sterile room was a chaotic, deafening symphony of alarms. The ventilator was screaming a high-pressure warning. The triple-channel IV pump was flashing yellow and red. Maggie ignored the dead man. Tomas, slumped heavily against the exterior wall. She slipped on a slick patch of his blood just inside the doorway, her rubber-soled shoe losing traction. She caught herself hard against the metal bedrail, her hip bone taking the brunt of the impact with a sickening jar. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the flare of pain. "Damn it, David, don't do this," she muttered. Her voice was raspy, dry as sandpaper, cracking on the syllables. She scanned the maze of medical lines. Her eyes, trained for years to find a sniper hidden in the chaotic visual noise of a rocky outcrop, now frantically traced the clear plastic tubing snaking around the hospital bed. There, the central line stitched into his right jugular, the direct conduit pumping life-sustaining vasopressors straight into his heart, had been clipped. The thick plastic tubing was completely severed, dripping clear, vital fluid uselessly onto the white cotton bedsheets. Hector's stray bullet had miraculously missed David's flesh, but it had severed his absolute lifeline. His blood pressure was tanking at a catastrophic rate, because the potent medication keeping his battered arteries constricted had suddenly stopped flowing. Okay, I got you." Maggie's hands were shaking violently now. The inevitable adrenaline crash was starting, making her fingers feel like thick, frozen, useless sausages. She reached into her lower scrub pocket, her fingers brushing past a handful of alcohol swabs, and grabbed a heavy pair of steel hemostats. The ones she usually used for clamping stubborn feeding tubes. She leaned over David, smelling the sour odor of fever sweat and iodine radiating from his skin. She clamped the heavy steel jaws of the hemostats down hard on the severed line, mere inches from his neck, crushing the plastic flat to stop any deadly air bubbles from being sucked into his vein. She needed a new line of access. She needed drugs. Immediately, Maggie bolted backward out of the room, leaping awkwardly over Thomas's outstretched, lifeless legs. The crash cart, the heavy red metal cart she had rammed into the first man's knee. The first man was dead on the floor. His face was a horrifying, congested mask of deep purple and ashen grey, his eyes staring sightlessly up at the acoustic ceiling tiles. He had suffocated on his own blood. Maggie stepped over his outstretched arm, feeling a momentary, nauseating wave of revulsion, and popped the breakaway red plastic lock on the top drawer of the crash cart. She yanked it open, the metal bearings screaming. Epinephrine. She needed a pre-filled cardiac syringe. Her bloody, slippery fingers fumbled desperately with the hard plastic packaging. She couldn't get a grip. She brought the package up to her mouth, bit down hard on the plastic casing with her teeth, and ripped it open, spitting the yellow plastic caps onto the floor. She grabbed a saline flush, attached it to the syringe with a clumsy twist, and rushed back into room 4. David's heart monitor was showing a jagged, terrifyingly fast rhythm. Ventricular tachycardia. His heart was beating so rapidly it was just quivering, failing to pump any actual blood to his brain. "Stay with me," she ordered harshly, her voice tight. She found a secondary access port on his left arm, a standard peripheral IV. "I didn't just ruin my perfect employment record for you to check out on me." She shoved the syringe into the port and pushed the medication hard, injecting the synthetic adrenaline directly into his bloodstream. She immediately followed it with the saline flush, forcing the heavy drug deep into his circulation. Then she waited. In the ICU, time is not measured in minutes. It is measured in the space between heartbeats. 10 seconds passed. 20 seconds. The ventilator kept pumping air mechanically into his lungs, ignorant of the dying heart beneath them. Whoosh, click, hiss. Maggie stared at the monitor, her hands resting flat on the cold metal bed rail, her knuckles stark white. Slowly, agonizingly, the jagged, chaotic peaks on the monitor began to stretch out. The frantic rhythm slowed, widening into recognizable waves. The arterial line pressure, reading from a different, intact wire in his wrist, began to steadily climb on the screen. 70/40, 85/50, 100/65. Normal sinus rhythm. Maggie collapsed backward into the hard, cheap plastic chair sitting beside the bed. Her legs simply refused to hold her weight for a single second longer. She dropped her head heavy between her knees, taking deep, shuddering breaths that rattled in her chest. The smell in the room was a horrific, layered perfume. Copper, ozone, burnt carbon, stale hospital coffee, and the sharp, chemical tang of epinephrine. Her right knuckle was throbbing with a deep, bruised ache where she had gripped the heavy trauma shears. The sciatic nerve in her back felt like a glowing hot wire pulled taut from her spine to her heel. "Maggie." A voice, small, trembling, utterly out of place. Maggie lifted her head slowly, her neck stiff and protesting. Kyle, the second-year resident physician, was standing in the shattered doorway of the ICU ward. He was wearing green scrubs and a fleece vest. He was staring, wide-eyed and pale, at the bodies on the floor, the glittering sea of shattered safety glass, and the sterile water still dripping steadily from the ceiling tiles. He looked like a child who had just woken up in a nightmare. He looked like he was about to vomit on his shoes. "Maggie." "What?" Kyle stammered, his knuckles white as he gripped the doorframe for physical support. What happened? Maggie sat up. Her spine popped loudly in the quiet room. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in a sticky, drying mixture of sterile water, medical adhesive, and human blood. She looked at David, his chest rising and falling in perfect, rhythmic mechanical time, oblivious to the war that had just been fought for his next breath. She reached into her front pocket and pulled out the crumpled, silver foil pack of peppermint gum. Her fingers were still shaking slightly as she popped a stale piece into her mouth and started chewing with slow, deliberate movements. "Visiting hours are over, Kyle," Maggie said flatly, the taste of artificial mint and rusted iron blooming on her tongue. "Call environmental services. We're going to need a bigger mop." Maggie survived the night, but when you leave 3 cartel bodies in a hospital ward, the war is just beginning. The police are on their way, but who do they really work for? If you want to see how Maggie handles the fallout and protects her mysterious patient, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Share this video with thriller fans. Drop a comment below. Should Maggie run or stay and fight?